Thayer, Rosser, Bowen, Griffin. If you've driven through Bismarck, some of these names probably sound familiar to you. But who were they? And why are their names on Bismarck's street signs? History Talk streams exclusively Thursdays at 10 a.m. on KFYR+. Most of Bismarck's early streets were named after agents of the Northern Pacific Railway, and you'll also notice that many of them have formal ranks, stemming from their service in the Civil War. Maine, Rosser, Thayer, and Meigs were the first named streets in Bismarck that weren't numbered. Washington, Mandan, Sweet, and Bowen were also named on the city's first plat map. Main Street needs no explanation. Nearly every town in America has one. We'll start with one that's not so obvious. People are probably wondering where Meigs Street is located. That's because it is no longer called Meigs. Broadway Avenue was called Meigs Street until March 1886. Even then, it was originally known as Broadway, with a space between the two words. This change was purely marketing, believing it to be more appropriate for the business district. Major Montgomery Meigs was a survey engineer for the Northern Pacific Railway between 1870 and 1873. He assisted in laying out Fort McKean, and likely assisted in laying out present-day Bismarck. He was also one of the first private citizens to own land in Bismarck. His father was General Montgomery Cunningham Meigs, who was Quartermaster General after the Civil War. Thayer Avenue was most likely named for Dr. Samuel W. Thayer, the first medical director for the Northern Pacific Railway. One source says it was named for James Bradley Thayer, a Harvard law professor who prepared a draft constitution for the future state of North Dakota, but the timing of his involvement with North Dakota and his lack of affiliation with the railroad makes this seem far less likely than Dr. Thayer. General Thomas Rosser was an engineer and surveyor for Northern Pacific who was appointed head of the survey party as the railroad headed through Dakota Territory. He was later instrumental in the bridge's construction and received national acclaim in 1879 for constructing Nature's Ice Bridge across the frozen river to transport supplies to the western side of the river. General Custer was a former classmate of Rosser's at the U.S. Military Academy and a close friend. Colonel George Sweet was a lawyer for Puget Sound, the auxiliary townsite company for Northern Pacific Railway, who took possession of land and secured a town site for what eventually became Bismarck. John Bowen was a judge and Burleigh County surveyor who, as an agent working for George Sweet and J.E. Turner, assisted in laying out Bismarck and selling the first land to private citizens. There are conflicting accounts to Porter Avenue's namesake with three possible contenders. One source suggests Dr. Henry Porter, who was a surgeon transferred to Camp Hancock in April 1873 and later to Fort Abraham Lincoln, where he is known as the only surgeon who survived the Battle of Little Bighorn. Another contender was George F. Porter, receiver of the Federal Land Office, considering George's antagonistic position against Edmonton, in which he allegedly conspired to steal the town through improper documentation and issuance of non-binding receipts. He's an unlikely contender. Yet another source says Porter was a member of George Sweet's party, and this seems the most likely given the sources of other street names. Dennis "Denny" Hannafin, known by nicknames Eccentric Denny and the Squatter Governor, was an early Bismarck pioneer, gambler, and businessman. He established one of the first local saloons and held various investments in coal and land. In fact, he is credited with discovering coal in Dakota Territory. Hannafin arrived in Dakota Territory in 1868, 4 years before the town that became Bismarck was founded. Upon discovering a coal stream west of present-day Mandan, he established Fort Hannafin to secure his interest and hold off Native Americans. Harmon Avenue was most likely named for Captain William Harmon, a pioneering post trader near Fort Rice. Brahman Avenue was likely named for Paul J. Brahman. I haven't been able to find out a whole lot of information on Paul Brahman, other than he was an original county commissioner for Eddy County. Jewel Murat Hannaford was the Assistant General Freight and Passenger Agent of the Northern Pacific, today's equivalent to Assistant Superintendent of Traffic, and he was eventual president of the railroad from 1913 to 1920. L.N. Griffin was the proprietor of Merchant's Hotel and later acquired the Capitol Motel. He was a reported millionaire who also owned a barber shop and 3 to 4 stores, as well as heavy real estate investment. Jim Tyler owned a ranch near present-day I-94. He was also a partner in Finney Drug. Development of Tyler's Western Village was announced on June 12, 1969. It was to include residential units, a shopping center, and a motel, but those never materialized. B.O. Ward owned a ranch that he eventually sold to Jim Tyler in 1948. The inspiration behind naming Century Avenue is unclear. I've heard some say Century Avenue was named for nearby Century High School, but this isn't correct, as it was called Century Avenue before the high school was even announced. There is no direct correlation between these two matching names. It is pure coincidence. The earliest confirmed reference to Century Avenue was in 1970, and the reference is very matter of fact, as if it's assumed everyone knows the road. Century wasn't selected as the name of the high school until 1973, and it was chosen among 70 possible suggestions. In fact, Capital City High was most favored. Century was ultimately selected only because the school was approved in 1972, Bismarck's centennial year. Some of Bismarck's streets are named after major developers and landholders. Wachter Avenue, Cavany Drive, and Wise Avenue being the best examples. The Wachters are deserving of their own segment. In brief, they once owned much of the land south of Front Avenue on the western side of Bismarck, and developed Kirkwood Mall on that land, which sparked significant development in southern Bismarck. Part of the Civic Center was also built on land donated by the Wachters. The Cavany family was involved in the development of both Northbrook Mall and Gateway Mall. William Wise owned a bunch of land around the area of present-day Century High School, and later developed Wise Commercial Park there. The city used eminent domain to acquire some of the land that Wise owned needed for the school, against his wishes, because he intended to expand his commercial park on that land. The city commission approved renaming Highway 83 from Boulevard Avenue North as State Street in 1975. The name, of course, is due to its proximity to the Capitol. Other government-inspired names nearby include Capitol Avenue, Senate Drive, and Governor Lane. In the mid-1970s, Bismarck enacted stricter naming conventions governing the naming of Bismarck streets. Until then, developers could name streets whatever they wanted. This is when the practice of streets running north and south and avenues running east and west became official. It also encouraged themed neighborhoods, so people could easily discern what part of town a street was located in, especially for first responders. The concept of themed neighborhoods wasn't new in the 1970s. It first sprouted in the 1950s. This is why you'll see clusters of similarly named streets next to each other, such as the space-themed streets clustered around North 4th Street, the presidential-named streets north of Divide, and the patriotic-inspired names in northeastern Bismarck. A more recent example of themed neighborhoods include the metal themes of silver, gold, and platinum drives. Let's hop over the river to Mandan, where the most known street named for a person is Collins Avenue. Collins Avenue was named for Father Daniel Collins of Mandan's St. Joseph Church. He personally contributed more than $13,000 towards the church's construction. This was originally called Stark Avenue, named for George Stark, who was vice president of the Northern Pacific Railroad between 1875 and 1879. Stark commenced the area's first significant agricultural operations in 1877. On 100 acres of land he owned 5 miles southeast of Bismarck. He brought in workers from Minnesota to break the sod. Stark County is also named for George Stark, where Dickinson is county seat. Today's 8th Avenue Northwest in Mandan was originally named Mitchell Street, named for J.J. Mitchell. Not a lot is known about Mitchell, other than he was one of Mandan's first landholders and an early businessman. He owned a log cabin that was later used as a schoolhouse. A Thomas J. Mitchell was in charge of supplying brush matting for the bridge dike. It's not known the relationship between these two men, but it's assumed there is one. That was a look at the origins of some of Bismarck and Mandan's street names. I invite you to check out my 2 Bismarck history books. They are available to purchase on Amazon and select local bookstores. Copies are also available at the Bismarck Public Library. Visit bismarckbook.com for more information. Next, we'll learn about the controversial former governor and Senator William Wild Bill Langer, forcibly removed from office only to return and later serve as a U.S. Senator. Is there a local history topic you'd like to be featured? Email suggestions to historytalk@kfyrtv.com.